All right, I think we're ready to get started. So first of all, welcome everyone. My name is Chris Kilford and I'm the president of the Canadian International Council here in Victoria and on Vancouver Island. And first of all, welcome to our CIC members and our guests and our guest speaker today. And also my friend and colleague, Dr. Jim Boutillier, who will be our moderator. And we're glad that everybody can be here today. Before we do start, it's important to recognize that CIC Victoria members live, work, and learn on Coast Salish territory, and in particular, the traditional lands of the Songhees and the Esquimalt First Nations. And I know many of you listening in today are CIC members, but if you are a guest today, the CIC is an independent membership-driven think tank, and we have that express mandate to engage Canadians on international affairs issues. And I think what makes us different, you've heard me say this before if you are a CIC member, is that we have branches across the country, 19 branches in all, plus a young professionals network, and our newest branch up in CIC, Whitehorse. And if you are a guest, just Google us, the Canadian International Council, and you'll be bound to find us. In a moment, I'll turn over the microphone to Dr. Boutillier. But I do want to mention that after Dr. Jim Boutillier, Jim and Paul have had a conversation, we will have time for an audience Q&A. We are recording this event as well. And this is part 2 of our look at Australia-China foreign relations. Some of you may have joined us for part 1 late last year with Peter Jennings, the executive director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. We had a great conversation with him. So this is sort of part 2 and gives us a bit of a Canadian flavor to what we see going on in Australia and with relations with China. So on that, I'd like to introduce Jim. As many of you know, Jim is an internationally recognized expert on Indo-Pacific defense and security issues. He's written extensively on maritime and security concerns and lectured nationally and internationally, including heading over to not long ago, the NATO Defense College in Rome. And he's also spoken at many, many other colleges and especially working closely with our defense folks in Ottawa and here in Esquimalt. And that brings me to his last post out here, which was for 25 years as the International Engagement Advisor to the Admiral in Maritime Forces Pacific Headquarters. So it's a real delight to always have Jim moderate our events. And so Jim, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Chris, for that generous introduction. It's a particular delight and honor for me this afternoon, or if you're in Canberra, in the morning, tomorrow, to introduce our speaker this afternoon, an old and dear personal and professional friend, Paul Madison. Paul is the director of the University of New South Wales Defence Research Institute, and thus is at the very heart of an exceedingly dynamic defense and security environment that has emerged over the past decade in Australia. He served for 37 years in the Royal Canadian Navy, and in fact became the commander of the Royal Canadian Navy before his retirement, highly decorated, including the Légion d'honneur from France and the Legion of Merit from the United States. And then he moved in his retirement to Australia, and after several years was approached by the Department of Foreign Affairs to serve as our High Commissioner in Australia. So thus he is uniquely positioned, a superb commentator on not only Australia, but Australia and Canada. And there are, of course, some fascinating and instructive structural parallels and differences between these two vast continental states, particularly with respect to their vision of what is happening in Asia and their willingness to prepare themselves in terms of sovereign defense. So after Vice Admiral Madison, Paul, to me, retired in 2019 from his position as High Commissioner. He was taken up by the University of New South Wales, and thus he is acting as an agent of change, of influence, of stimulating the debate and dialogue in Australia in terms of the way forward in an increasingly challenging Indo-Pacific environment. So it's with delight and pleasure that I turn the floor over to you, Paul, to brief us over the next 25 minutes or so on Australia's vision of its security challenges and what some of the lessons might be for us far away here in Canada. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Jim, for that equally generous introduction. And thank you, Chris, for the introduction or the invitation to be with you here today with your members on the West Coast. I'm in Canberra in Southeast Australia, as you know, and I'm on the traditional land of the Ngunnawal people. The Ngunnawal people, stewards of this land for tens of thousands of years before the arrival of the British settlers and, of course, the colonial disruption that ensued. And I pay my respects to the Ngunnawal elders, past, present, and emerging. Look, it's pretty daunting to be introduced and to be alongside virtually Dr. Jim Boutillier. Jim, not only a great friend, but a legend. And someone in my generation of naval officers, we all learned so much growing up, listening to Jim. The best extemporaneous speaker I have ever come across. And of course, it's daunting to be here as he's marking my my presentation here today. But I just want to recognize Jim's enormous contribution in Canada to strategic thought, to understanding the Asia-Pacific, now the Indo-Pacific, understanding what has happened over the past decades in terms of China's meteoric rise and the challenges presented by the evolution in leadership of the Chinese Communist Party and a whole number of things that we're going to talk about here today. I remember very fondly just over 20 years ago when I was commanding HMCS Calgary out of Esquimalt. I had the great privilege of hosting Jim on board during a Southeast Asian deployment. And I will never forget, I think, Jim, it was in Manila, it was in Bangkok, it was in Singapore. We would go on official calls, whether it was the head of the Navy or whether it was a political minister or whomever. And Jim would give me these 10-minute, 15-minute sort of briefings in the back of a car. And it was an historical sort of tour de force. And I remember sitting there thinking, wow, this man is such a strategic jewel. And we are so lucky to have him. And I learned so much from you, Jim. So just wanted to acknowledge that. I know you were awarded the Vimy Award a year or two ago in recognition of your leadership and your achievement. And clearly it's evident here that I'm among your greatest fans. And thank you for your service to Canada. So look, Australia and China, you talked to Peter Jennings already, or you heard from Peter. Peter's a friend, an enormous influence here in Canberra and across Australia. The Australian Strategic Policy Institute is a think tank that you know it's doing the right thing when it's routinely criticized in the Global Times and mentioned in press conferences put on by foreign ministry spokespeople in Beijing. You know, Peter has a much in-depth understanding of Australia and China than I do. But I thought I would just share, you know, some of my own sort of context here this morning. And I'm really looking forward to the Q&A. Before I sort of talk about Australia, China, though, I need to make it really clear that all of this has to be shaped through the lens of the Australia-United States relationship. And so I'm going to talk a bit about Australia and China, but I'm then going to get on to the Australian relationship talk about the alliance, talk about AUKUS, and kind of, and hopefully show why Australia's approach is so much a function of how strategically vital is that values and security relationship with the United States. I came down here in 2015, so I've been out of Canada now for 6.5 years. It was a really interesting environment. When I got here, Malcolm Turnbull had just spilled Tony Abbott as the Prime Minister. And so when I went in to deliver my letter of introduction that which was originally signed by Stephen Harper, we had to go back to Prime Minister Trudeau and get him to sign it, because I got here just as the election was taking place. But all to say, I went in to see Prime Minister Turnbull, and we had a great conversation. And at one point he said, "I'd like to ask you a question, not as the Canadian High Commissioner, but as a former admiral. What do you think is happening in the South China Sea?" I thought, well, okay. So I went back to my lessons from Dr. Jim, and I spoke for 5 to 10 minutes to the Prime Minister on what my view was of what the PLA and the CCP were up to in the South China Sea, which was not at all complimentary. And I, basically said, they're undermining the rules-based order. They are undermining a free and open maritime trade-based economy. They are undermining our values. They are challenging international maritime law. This is all bad. And under the guise of, international search and rescue, or whatever lie they were using at the time, this is bad. And Prime Minister, we need, my recommendation would be you take a stand. And he looked at me and he said, "I could not disagree with you more." And I thought, oh, this is not good. I mean, my first engagement with the Prime Minister, and I'm about to be thrown out of his office. And he said to me, "Look, I was a businessman, and if you don't know, Malcolm Turnbull is worth tens of millions, and his son is married to a Chinese, and which is neither here nor there, but it just shows he has an understanding of the economics between Australia and China." And he said, I can't accept the argument that China would shoot itself in the foot so obviously by doing this, knowing that they will inevitably cut off the economic trade opportunities that have fueled their incredible growth with partners like the United States, Australia, Europe, and others. And so that caused me to think. And at the time in 2015, the Business Council of Australia was routinely taking trade delegations up to Guangzhou, up to Beijing, up to Shanghai. The embassy there, just like Canada's embassy, was on fire with trade commissioners looking for a greater bilateral trade and investment opportunities. Politicians routinely bragged in Australia that it was the only G20 economy that had not seen recession for well over 25 years. And the level of prosperity here in Australia, the social safety net, and the ease at which people seem to be making money and growing personal wealth was just extraordinary. And it was all significantly fueled by that trade relationship with China. So 30% of export going up into China, Western Australian iron ore basically fueling the huge infrastructure boom in China. East Coast clean coal from Queensland, New South Wales, going up in shiploads. Wine, lobster, agriculture products, dairy, meat. Everybody was pretty high on trade with China. So it was all pretty positive. The security community, of course, had been ringing the alarm bells for quite a while. And there was this constructive tension in Canberra between the panda huggers and the panda sluggers. And, the defense and security community were seen as kind of Luddite, backward-looking um, sort of fear-based thinkers like Peter Jennings, and others were much more, saw themselves as progressive. We're still running with this aspiration around the inevitable democratization of the Chinese Communist Party on greater exposure to the rules-based international order that had come out of World War II, the US-led rules-based international order that based on freedom, values of democracy that we all agree with. But it's been a really interesting few years since that particular point. In 2016, in the wake of the arbitral tribunal ruling on the Philippines' complaint against China in the South China Sea, a prominent opposition politician named Sam Dastyeri, who had come from the New South Wales Labour faction, stood up and actually supported China's position. And the media and academia and others in Australia kind of looked up and went, what? Where did that come from? And as people sort of dug into this, what the security community had known, what the agencies were already aware of, came into the public awareness, and that was that the Chinese Communist Party had deliberately and methodically over time run an influence campaign at the state level, not just in New South Wales, but also in Victoria and elsewhere, around shaping, financing, encouraging China-friendly, CCP-friendly politicians to grow in influence across the political framework here in Australia. That was a bit of a shocker. And the funding source for that particular episode, a man who I can't remember his name, but a multimillionaire. It turns out he was being financed by Beijing as well. He went back to China for a visit. Australia just promptly canceled his visa, and he never came back. But it opened up a whole sort of strategic dialogue in Australia around foreign interference, and it really upset Australians to begin to fully appreciate the degree to which they were our values, our system, our sovereign independence was being deliberately undermined by a foreign power. So much so that Malcolm Turnbull, the man who I had, had a polite disagreement with in 2015, stood up in 2017, I think it was, around the 19th Congress timing, and very forcefully and publicly in a speech in Sydney, attended by the Chinese ambassador, criticized the Chinese Communist Party for its poor behavior. That led to Beijing completely closing the communication pipes with Australia. So that was the beginning of that big deep freeze. Economic coercion followed, and there was an assumption from Beijing that small little Australia, 25 million people, a $1.2 trillion economy, pretty insignificant actually, would cave, and this small little cranky voice in the Antipodes would be silenced, and the greater sort of momentum of the CCP would continue unabated. I think they really underestimated the political grit, national and strategic will that exists here in Australia. And so Australia, in a way, became that sort of bellwether. So countries like Canada, even the US and UK and others kind of watched to see how this was going to play. Here was Australia on its own, so to speak, having the strategic courage to call out China for its unacceptable behavior, knowing that they were taking real economic risk, and knowing that this could create a political wedge between the Labour and the Liberal parties that could create a wedge at the state political versus Commonwealth political levels, and could create a real problem with the electorate in terms of the average Australian saying, look, what are you doing? I own a vineyard in South Australia. The Chinese are willing to pay 10 times more a bottle for my wine than the French will. So get out of the way. So it's been really interesting to watch how the Commonwealth government has brought Australia along on this journey. And most Australians pretty much support Australia's view. So, where are we now? Well, China keeps consuming Australian iron ore at an extraordinary rate. So there never was any economic coercion around what is a strategic need in China. And so, notwithstanding the pandemic disruption, the economy is in pretty good nick. And the Prime Minister said yesterday he expects to see unemployment fall below 4% mid-year, which is kind of extraordinary, and it's probably related to an election that's coming before then. Australia has been able to parse out two different strategic dialogues with China when China is willing to have a conversation, and one is around the importance of the economic relationship, and the other is around security and values and the unwillingness of Australia to accept this kind of subversion around democratic governance here. And China seems to have come to a point of respecting that. And I think it's an important sort of lesson, perhaps, for Canadians to hoist in. Let me quickly talk a bit, go back to what I said I would touch on, and that is the US. So look, one of the big differences between Australia and Canada is geography. And, Canadians can never take should never take for granted the 9,000 kilometer border of the United States, how strategically important that has been over the past 150 years or so. Whereas Australia is here, really at the far edge of the world. Arguably, one of the books I read when I first came down here by a former diplomat, Alan Gingell, a really good man, was called Fear of Abandonment. And in this book, he kind of laid out how Australia, the shock of the Second World War, there were a number of shocks. The first shock was the fall of Singapore and the sort of retrenchment by Churchill of all of his strategic capability into the UK, into Britain, to actually save Britain from such an existential threat out of Europe. And Australia found itself kind of down here without much support. The second shock was the series of attacks that the Japanese brought into Northern Australia, not just one or two bombing raids of Darwin, but a series of consecutive significant bombings of Darwin, of other infrastructure up in Northern Australia, across far north Queensland, down the coast, south of Cairns. And Australians were really concerned. I mean, the country was only about 40 years old at the time, really concerned about what the future might lie. There was even talk of this kind of retreat south of the Brisbane line. But what happened was that the United States, Nimitz, MacArthur, as they executed the amazing strategy around the Pacific Campaign and came into the Battle of the Coral Sea in 1942, it was the Battle of the Coral Sea where Australia feels that the US actually saved the country from a significant invasion with an uncertain future. Australia has never forgotten that, has always seen the US as that guarantor of security. And that led to the ANZUS alliance, or the Strategic Alliance in 1951. And Australia has always considered it to be a strategic vital interest that the United States be active, engaged, in the Indo-Pacific region in a way that guarantees that international rules-based order that we know that our prosperity and security depends upon. Now, for many years, folks criticized Australia, especially on the left side of politics, as kind of wanting to be the deputy sheriff to the United States. But it's kind of interesting what has happened over the past several years is that the United States is actually, its respect for Australia has risen enormously over the past, say, 10 years. Its respect for the leadership and the strategic integrity displayed here in Australia around its willingness to stand up for what it believes is right, its willingness to stand up to China, its willingness to engage constructively with key Indo-Pacific partners, Japan, South Korea, Indonesia, Singapore, India, Vietnam, the Philippines, the South Pacific island countries, all with a view to being a champion for multilateral engagement, for fairness, for ensuring that a level playing field internationally is sustained, and that that China is not allowed to unresisted move on its strategy to change that level playing field to a tilted one in its own to its own advantage. So recently I heard Kurt Campbell, who's in the Biden administration, very well known senior diplomat in the Indo-Pacific out of the States, say that actually the United States has now become a deputy sheriff to Australia. That they see Australia as actually leading the strategic dialogue here, and Australia through the 2+2, the AusMin talks every year, the defense and foreign secretaries meet with the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense annually to discuss strategic issues. And Australia has been increasingly going to Washington, or when they come here to Sydney, Canberra, bringing the big ideas and really agitating for the U.S. to become even more fully engaged here in the region, to increase its force posture in Northern Australia, to increase its commitment and support to Pacific Island countries, for example, who are subject to some interesting coercion, Belt and Road type stuff from China, and this has, I think, culminated in the AUKUS agreement. And the AUKUS agreement, and I can talk more about that in the Q&A, but the AUKUS agreement is a real game changer. This is about taking that inner core of strategic trust that has always been the Five Eyes, and kind of narrowing it down to an even tighter inner core of the UK, US, and Australia. And it's not, and I'm sorry to contradict Prime Minister Trudeau, but it is not just about nuclear propelled submarines. It is about much, much more. It is about accelerating the concept to capability cycle in the defense space. It's about bringing the best minds in Australian universities, UK universities, US universities, defense labs, defense scientists, defense industry, bringing them all together in a much more collaborative and agile way to accelerate the translation of fundamental research into commercialized and deployable capability for Australia and our allies. Why? Because China has clearly emerged as the pacing threat, as the PLA has developed capabilities that arguably have achieved peer or even overmatch against the US and its allies. And so this is about um, key trusted partners agreeing on the nature of the threat, agreeing that this is the decade of consequence in terms of the China relationship, and knowing that we have to up our game and really drive hard to deliver that deterrent effect in the Indo-Pacific. And through that AUKUS example, I think there is intent to incentivize, to motivate, to attract others to lift games as well, including Canada, but also our key allies here in Japan, which also has signed a strategic partnering agreement with Australia, only the second such agreement, the first, of course, with the United States decades ago. And India, another strategic partnering agreement recently. So I'm talking to Japan around defense research. I'm talking to India around defense research. I'm talking to South Korea. I'm talking to Singapore. Obviously talking to the UK. I was talking to France. Things are a bit cold there due to submarines. But just to say that it's a pretty exciting time. And I will stop there, given the desire for Q&A. Jim, I hope, I mean, how do you talk about Australia, China in 25 minutes? It's pretty hard. But I hope I've just given you a flavor here for at least how I see some of the issues today around the relationship between China, Australia, and the United States.
Thank you so very much, Paul. That was superb. And I must say that I cannot thank you enough for your extraordinarily generous comments at the beginning of your commentary. Let me exercise my moderator's privilege and put a question to you, and then turn the floor over to Chris for the Q&A. The background to your comments, I think, is what many journalists would suggest is the greatest defense buildup in Australian history since the Second World War. And certainly when I look at the Royal Australian Navy in particular, there is an amazing array of hardware which is coming down the slipways. And the Australians have always struck me as far more muscular and resolute when it comes to defense. Maybe a measure of their geostrategic isolation and the shifts in the Eurasian landmass in terms of threat perceptions. But when I look at the way in which the Australians have embraced this defense acquisition program, and I think of the relative passivity here in Canada, I'd be curious about your comments on the program and what you think drives that muscularity that seems to be the backdrop to defense acquisition in Australia.
A great question, Jim. Thanks for that. I've always been struck by Australia's appetite for risk. When I was in Ottawa, I always felt that when I was trying to drive, a capital naval acquisition program, and I was the commander of the Navy that took the memorandum to cabinet with Peter MacKay for the Canadian Surface Combatant in January of 2012. Okay, so now it's January of 2022, so 10 years ago. And the Canadian Surface Combatant, tell me where that is. And my sense was that in Ottawa, everybody was trying to reduce risk to zero. Or anyway, I don't want to get into a commentary about Ottawa. But what I found here in Australia is that there actually is an appetite for risk. There is a knowing that if they're going to actually get the requirement into industry through the political process and actually out into the field, into the air and at sea, there's going to be casualties. There's going to be political casualties. There's going to be industry problems. The media is going to be all over them. But they're willing to do that because they, and I guess I can say we, I live here now. We see the compelling need to defend Australia in the event of some attack on our sovereign, our sovereign capability. And in the region, we see, we see the Chinese actively undermining governments of our near neighbors. So our Melanesian friends in Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, it's just, it's a clear threat. I mean, it's kind of like Cuba in '62. Perhaps not a good example, but in terms of an island and proximity. China having a maritime base that close to Australia is red line. So the idea is, and if you look at the Defense Strategic Update of 2020 and the force structure policy also of 2020 that came out of defense, it's about the key words are a deter, shape, and respond. So deter adversarial activity in the region, shape through diplomacy and that sort of muscular approach, partnership building, trust building, shape the region as we would see fit, and respond. And this is the key. Australia is not taking the United States for granted in terms of being there to defend sovereign Australia. And so there is a real focus on expeditionary capability at range, and with an ability to sustain a persistent and lethal deployed capability. So when you look at what the Australian Defence Force structure has evolved towards, it's much broader and much deeper than anything Canada has shown a willingness to spend on. So the F-35s are here. The P-8 maritime patrol aircraft are here. Northrop Grumman's Triton high altitude UAV is coming. There's an amphibious landing component, which is great along the lower end of the spectrum of operations. There's an amphibious landing ship alongside in Tonga at the moment, in the wake of the underwater volcanic disaster. You see the nuclear propelled submarine program, all with a view to getting that submarine up north, far north, and deployed for extended periods. And all of this, there's a huge amount of risk to this. And there's a huge amount of capital being invested. So $270 billion in this decade for new capability. 4 billion of that is research. That's why I'm having so much fun down here. I don't know if you can kind of imagine this, but if you could imagine, so my university is sort of level with McGill or University of Toronto in terms of global rankings. So we're a pretty impressive university. And when I came to the university 2.5 years ago, a lot of the growth and the research intensive activity at the university was being fueled by Chinese money. It was being fueled by Chinese co-investment, by Chinese student revenue, and there was almost an ideological aversion, as you can understand as an academic, Jim, to seeing China as anything other than a partner, a collaborator. Yeah, there's some issues, but we can work our way through those. What I've seen, and I guess the fact that I was asked to stand up a Defense Research Institute was recognition that the tertiary sector here in Australia was recognizing that the times were changing, and there was a real need, and there was a demand signal being generated by government with real dollars to gear the research ecosystem as much as you can towards enabling the solving of big defense problems, the ones that keep the chiefs of service awake at night. And there's been a realization among universities that in doing this, they're actually serving the national interest. So universities have there was some resistance, but universities have now, because it was legislated, but they were they were happy to come along on the journey to set up countering foreign interference programs on our campuses, that sort of thing. The last thing I would say is, look, for a country with an economy that's 2/3 the size of Canada's, Australia is spending a heck of a lot more investing in military capability. I think Canadians, and I've said this before in other fora, I think Canadians should really look at this. And if Canada, if Canada continues to see itself as a significant influencer on the global stage, it takes more than values. It takes more than leading on climate, which are all good things. It takes more than leading on gender, which again is extremely important. It takes more than Indigenous reconciliation, which again is extremely important. My view is that Canada, if its voice wants to be heard at the same level that Australia's is increasingly being heard, there's a real need to recognize the threat and to invest fast. And I'm sorry, but I just don't see that happening at the moment. And that's just an interesting contrast, I guess, between the two countries.
Yes, thank you for that. One of the things I wrote to a colleague was that I kept looking for a sense of urgency in Canada, and I was unable to find it. But let me turn the floor over to Chris, because I'm sure he has an array of questions from our viewers. Thank you, Paul. Chris.
Thank you, Jim. And for our audience, if you have questions for Paul, we do have a Q&A section down below, so please type your questions there and we'll get to them. And we do have a question from Laurie Hahn, and Laurie says that you pretty much answered his question, but I'm delighted actually we do have a question from Laurie Hahn, because for our audience, Laurie was the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of National Defence from 2007 to 2011. So we're delighted that you're here with us today. And Paul, he asked, what do you think Canada needs to do to be taken more seriously, like Australia? But not just in regards to China, but to the the international defense and security situation writ large. Perhaps you could kind of revisit that and talk about what we're not doing well.
Hey, Laurie, thank you for your question, and great. I can't see you, but it's nice to see you on online. I remember you well when we were both in 101, different floors doing different things. Look, I try to resist appearing critical to Canadian policy at the moment. Canada is hugely respected as a G7 economy, as a nation that has fought alongside allies for what is right for well over 100 years. And Five Eyes, the Northern SIGINT during the Cold War, our leadership in NATO, the battle group in Latvia, our participation in Afghanistan. I'm hugely respected here in Australia for all of that and more. But my sense is that Australia and others have been looking for Canada to acknowledge some of the geostrategic imperatives around the situation we find ourselves in, and looking for Canada as a G7 economy, as a champion for the values that underpin the rules-based international order and democracy, to kind of step up the game on the defense and security side. I know there's a lot happening at the agency level. There's a great deal of collaboration. When I was High Commissioner, I had agency representation here at the High Commission. I had an RCMP inspector here. I had CBSA officials here. There's a great deal of collaboration going on at the operational level, and by far the most number of visits from Ottawa to Canberra came from defense. So great, deep, strong, trust-based relationships at the general and flag officer level, and that's great to see. But I think what Australia, the US, and others are looking for is for the Canadian government to actually stand up and say, okay, this isn't 2015 anymore. The world that we were envisioning in the last decade has simply not come to be. And in fact, it's gone quite the other way. And the inflection point for me was the 19th Congress in 2017, in which Xi Jinping declared what the long-term agenda was for the Chinese Communist Party. And I didn't see that really acknowledged strategically in Canada. I think there should have been we're still waiting for an Indo-Pacific policy out of Global Affairs Canada. So there's been no real policy statement out of Global Affairs Canada or any foreign minister for years, certainly not since Trudeau was elected in 15. So allies are a bit confused as to what is Canada's strategic intent. I think the Indo-Pacific strategy, if there is one that's at the publishers in Ottawa and ready to be announced by the minister or the prime minister, there's an opportunity, I hope, there to make a very clear statement about where Canada stands vis-a-vis China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, and others, and how we in Canada view our full and equal partnering with the United States, Australia, UK, New Zealand, NATO partners, and key Indo-Pacific partners like Japan, Korea, India, the others I mentioned, how we see that as a vital national strategic security interest. And then following that, this is how we are going to reinvest, accelerate, and incentivize defense industry, our publicly funded research agencies and universities to really change the culture, change the defense innovation ecosystem, and really get on board in terms of delivering capability for the Canadian warfighter in a way that will ensure that when push comes to shove, Canada has the ability. We have the people. We have extraordinary men and women in uniform, in service to Canada today, but that they have the capability to operate in this incredibly rapidly evolving multi-domain operating environment, which is being driven by hypersonics, by intelligentized LEO-sat space constellations, by machine learning and AI-enabled command and control, by long-range strike, by a whole new approach to undersea sensing. But I mean, there's a real transformation in what's happening in the defense space, and a lot of that transformation actually is coming out of China, who have had the ability as an authoritarian regime to dictate an acceleration through civil military fusion, which is a real problem for us in universities, because we know that any university that we collaborate with or have collaborated with in China actually is answerable to the CCP and to the PLA. So that's an issue. So long-winded way of saying, I think that is a way for Canada to lift. Unfortunately, I don't see this Liberal government as having any interest in defense. I have, in my lifetime, seen very few Liberal governments with any interest in defense. I think Paul Martin came closest in the aftermath of 9/11. And again, I'm becoming a bit critical. But I really think Canada, what I'm afraid of is that Canada will find itself outside that inner sphere of influence where the great decisions are going to be made over the next few years.
I have a question also now from Don Scott, who you mentioned about universities in Australia becoming dependent on research money and Chinese students. And he's asking, have Australian universities reduced their acceptance of Chinese money, and the number of Chinese students is, in light of everything that's been happening, has that dropped off? How have things changed over the last few years?
I guess, thank you for the question, Don. I guess the greatest change that's happened in universities amongst the vice chancellors and the senior leadership teams at the universities is that business as usual was no longer going to be. That the endless, well, not endless, the frequent flights up into China, the banquets, the signing ceremonies, the $100 million innovation precincts that universities were landing, and these, a lot of these are of great value, in terms of collaborating around health sciences, agricultural science, climate. That's a great way to continue the conversation with China and to continue to influence and mitigate some of the more disruptive behavior out of Beijing. But what became clear was the government didn't, it wasn't an ultimatum, although it kind of felt that way, where ministers of education and prime ministers were basically saying, you're either with us or you're not, which was unfair. And vice chancellors weren't pleased with that. But at the end of the day, universities have changed their behavior and are much more supportive of the Commonwealth's strategic intent around translating fundamental research into commercialized sovereign capability. And it's not just around defense. Chinese students are still very much an important part of the foreign student cohort. The pandemic has actually been hugely disruptive, as you would appreciate. And Australia's settings around opening international borders have lagged behind others like Canada. And so what we've found is that Chinese students have decided to move from Australia to Canada, to Australia, and to the UK. And so the $40 billion international student sector here in Australia, which was about double or more Canada's, that has shrunk. And we're seeing a lot of students who would have chosen to come to Australia go to Canada, for example. That's really interesting. But we still have a lot of online Chinese students. When it comes to defense research, increasingly we are being pulled into more secure infrastructure around defense-related research. I often have to ensure that our researchers are Australian citizens, even though we have some brilliant, quantum physicists from India or folks like that. We have to be really careful. And the government has, we have something here called the Defense Industry Security Program. Universities have been required to become accredited in defense research across 4 pillars: governance, personnel security, infrastructure security, and cybersecurity. And so we can't just sort of take a funded program, even if it's fundamental unclassified research. We have to have demonstrated that we have the mechanisms in place to ensure that whatever is discovered will not be inadvertently or deliberately or shared with a foreign power. And, from defense's perspective, no innovative capability discovery is worth anything if it if it immediately falls into a potential adversary's hands and is re-engineered and suddenly finds itself, we find it in the field as a challenge. So hopefully, Don, that answers your question.
I have another question here from Norm Leslie, and it's, I guess, in relation to Chinese investments in Australia and the Port of Darwin. He's mentioning a 99-year lease by a major Chinese company. And I'm wondering, how does that play out in the context of what we're seeing with China these days?
That's a really good question, Norm, and it's a vexing one. So when the port was leased to a Chinese state-owned company in, I think it's Landbridge, back in, can't remember if it was 16 or 17. I know the United States was really upset because my colleague, the U.S. and Chargé was a really good friend, and the Australia got its back up and basically said to the Americans, "Look, we've done the risk analysis. You know, it's a port. It's a commercial port. If you've been to Darwin, it's a commercial port. It also hosts a small but growing naval base. There is an Air Force wing up in the Northern Territory just south of Darwin, and there is also an Army base. But the important thing is that 600 Marines, U.S. Marines, cycle through 6-month deployments in Darwin, and it is very clear. The signals coming out of the last ministerial between Australia and the U.S. and a statement made by the Australian Defense Minister yesterday, it's very clear that U.S. force posture is going to increase, that the strategic importance of Northern Australia as a deployment base for strike assets is going to grow. So I expect to see significant infrastructure investment in Northern Australia in the short to longer term. Now, around the 99-year lease, the former Secretary of Foreign Affairs here, he was also the former Defense Secretary, Dennis Richardson, has repeatedly said, "Look, it doesn't matter who runs the port. Anybody can go down onto the jetty and kind of look out to sea and count people and take pictures of license plates or whatever. The military capability is sort of further from the port, and I think it's secure. So it's at least publicly, the Australian government has not expressed any concern. The United States government, as I said, kind of came out with a please explain when it was announced, and I think there was a bit of it was a bit inelegant in that the U.S. had not been briefed in advance. But that said, I think the Americans are okay. But it is a really interesting question.
Paul, Jim, would you be okay if we just went for 5 more minutes so that I can squeeze in another question or two?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because a lot of questions have been coming in, and we're blessed here in Victoria by having so many experts on China. And one of them is Hugh Stevenson. Hugh's talking about nuclear submarines. And this actually came up in a talk yesterday that we had on the Arctic and our good old 1987 white paper, where Canada said that we would acquire a fleet of nuclear powered submarines. And of course, we never did. And of course, we know the US was not happy with that whole idea way back when. But now we see Australia, different strategic needs, as Hugh is pointing out, sort of wondering, how did this play out? Because it's a big step to go from conventional class submarines to nuclear powered submarines. It seemed to be very easy on the surface. So what were the drivers behind that big decision?
So great question, Hugh, and hello. I didn't realize this until recently, but Australia has been driving for a nuclear submarine capability for a long time, and it's been driven by the requirement. So when you do the math, and you won't see a lot of this publicly, but when you do the math, the assumption is you want a boat on station for an extended period of time where it matters. So South China Sea, as an example. And so nuclear is the best option in terms of endurance, range, on station time, etc. So Australia had asked this question a number of times in the past to the Americans, maybe to the Brits. Asking the Brits really was kind of academic anyway, because the Brits could not really give an answer without US approval. So and the US answer had always been no. You know, we had this agreement with the Brits in 1958 that was a one-off, and no. But to go back to what I said a little earlier about the United States recognizing or respecting enormously the strategic courage and the regional leadership displayed, global leadership displayed by Australia around the behavior of Xi Jinping and the CCP, recognizing 100 years of mateship. You know, President Biden's recent statement in September around UNGA, when Scott Morrison called on him, that the United States has no closer or more reliable ally than Australia. Now, if I was Canadian, I am Canadian, that would kind of, that would get my attention. And a couple of days later, when Prime Minister Trudeau's government was reelected, President Biden's statement was, Canada is among our closest partners. For me, the difference between those two statements was huge. So why I bring that up is that my sense is that the United States has recognized in Australia a vital partner, a vital partner in the campaign, which is the most important strategic priority of the United States and should be for all of us, which is how to deal with China. It's not Russia in the Ukraine, although that's obviously a key concern, and that's another meeting, I'm sure, Chris. I think with Australia approaching the UK initially at the Chief of Navy level and sort of sounding out, would you folks be supportive if we went to the Americans and had this conversation? Knowing that the UK is an extremely influential ally of the United States, and Washington listens to what London has to say. And that conversation went well. So into the conversation with the Americans, and I think it was that trust and that recognition that things have changed, and that Australia needs to be supported in every way to achieve its strategic intent in the region, which from a security and defense perspective is to shape and deter aggression, and if necessary to respond in a meaningful way. And so I think that's what kind of got it across the line. Now, I'm involved in this nuclear submarine sort of discussion here in Australia. My university runs the only nuclear engineering program in the country, and so I do spend time with the head of the Nuclear Propelled Submarine Task Force, a serving Vice Admiral, around some of the challenges he's facing. And if you think about it, there's no nuclear power infrastructure in Australia compared to Canada. And so to go back to what I said earlier to Jim about Australia's appetite for strategic risk, this is another great example. No nuclear infrastructure, no nuclear expertise, a population that has largely become used to being a non-nuclear and anti-nuclear country, and the trajectory from here to deploying a high readiness nuclear, SSN out of the West Coast base and deploying up to the South China Sea. That's an amazing journey that's going to happen here over the next 10 to 15 years. But if any country can do it, it's Australia, and the UK and America, and UK, America, and Australian defense industry and academia are going to work together to get them across the line.
Thank you for that. I'm mindful of the time, but I do have a question. I've got questions about New Zealand, of course. One more, Jonathan Manthorpe, and I'm not sure if you've read his book, Claws of the Panda.
I haven't, but I've heard of it. Sorry, John, it's on my list.
So we'll have to get you a copy of that book. But Jonathan's just asking, in light of the Huawei affair that we've seen play out here in Canada over the last few years, it's clear that the CCP isn't our friend. Why don't you think Canadian opinion makers are not getting the message about dealing with China? Why do we seem to be walking a fine line? What's your thoughts on that?
Well, look, thanks, Jonathan, and I am aware of your book, and it's on my list. Look, I haven't been in Canada for 6.5 years, and I'm beginning. I do these family Zooms with my family, across the country. Some of you will know that my older brother Greg retired as DCDS and was also commander of the Navy. So we do talk about what's happening in the defense and security space, and I'm not sure I fully understand how things have evolved over the past few years. So I will say that I think the think tank infrastructure in Australia and the media networks in Australia are stronger and more influential and more respected by politicians, and more listened to by politicians and decision makers than you see in Canada. You met with Peter Jennings. He goes in and briefs ministers, prime ministers. The Australian media is, quite interesting. You've got the Sydney Morning Herald, which is kind of slightly left of center. You've got the Australian, which is Murdoch owned and right of center. But there's a whole network of really good editorialists who are very well informed and who have sources, not just in Australia, but around the world. And they write well, and they inform the debate. I remember one of my very first meetings with an influential journalist from the Australian, and we were having breakfast in Sydney 5-6 years ago, and his phone rang, and he took it, and then he said, that was a minister, I won't tell you who it was, who was telling me what happened in cabinet yesterday, so I can write about it. And so there's this strategic nexus here that shapes that dialogue, brings the business community along with them. And I see the Business Council of Australia, like the chief executive of the Business Council of Australia is a woman named Jennifer Westacott. She's a pretty amazing woman. And I think she's the only person I know who can fly into Canberra and just sort of walk into the PM's office and sit down and talk policy. And she, she's in there talking about, okay, these are what Australia's leading chief executives are worried about in terms of the economic relationship with China. This is how they are responding to some of your policy suggestions. This is how we could perhaps shape it up the middle. But at the end of the day, we get it. It's about Australia. It's about sovereign interests, and we'll do what we need to do alongside you. I just don't get a sense that the same sort of coherence is evident in Canada. I still see signs of business executives, Goldie Hyder and what he's doing with the Business Council there. I still see this desire to kind of go back to business as usual and figure out a way to get Beijing to kind of back off, so we can, get in there, grow our businesses, grow prosperity and jobs for Canadians, get more trade commissioners out of Global Affairs Canada to be running around looking for more opportunities. But I don't know how you do that when Xi Jinping has declared against Canadian interests. I'm not sure how you square that circle. So I would encourage people like you, Jonathan. I mean, there are some pretty good journos in Canada. Obviously, one of my favorites is Terry Glavin or Glavin. I think he's spot on most of the time. And I just think you just need to keep at it, and keep clamoring for attention, keep writing, keep talking, and inevitably it's going to be the behavior of Beijing that brings Canadians a greater focus on what is important, and what it is they are prepared to stand and fight for.
Jim, I'll turn back over to you.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Paul, for an absolutely brilliant exposition. It was wonderful to see you, and I'm speaking personally and in a sort of selfish manner, but I'm sure that each and every one of our listeners in the CIC series learned an enormous amount from your candor and your insights, particularly positioned as you are in Australia, but with your Canadian roots. And so I can't thank you enough for your time today on our behalf. And I wish you all the very best at the University of New South Wales. And I hope, building on our earlier conversation, that some of the decisions that are in the offing come your way. Thank you so very much, Paul.
Thank you very much, Jim. Thank you, Chris. Thank you to your members for your interest. Great questions. And I encourage you to keep looking at Australia as a great friend, as a great ally, and as Canada's closest comparator when it comes to public policy, not just in defense and security, but in all aspects. Australia and Canada have so much to learn from one another, and I think the tyranny of distance and the tyranny of the urgent has actually kept us from fully exploiting the potential of that Australia-Canada relationship over the past few years. But anyway, have a great evening, everyone. I'll get back to my workday here in Canberra. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.